It was a normal day at the little diner on Main Street. The sun was shining, and inside, things were busy. Plates made loud clinking sounds as they hit the tables. Coffee splashed into cups, and the smell of pancakes filled the air. Sarah Miller was running around, carrying trays and smiling at everyone. She was fast, like a superhero zooming between tables. Everyone liked Sarah. She was sweet, like candy, and she worked hard, never complaining. If someone dropped a spoon, she'd pick it up. If a kid spilled juice, she'd wipe it up with a big grin. People thought she was just a regular waitress, a girl who served food and said please and thank you. But here's the thing, Sarah had a secret. A big, exciting secret. Nobody knew the real Sarah yet. And oh boy, were they in for a surprise. Outside the diner, a fancy black car rolled up. It was shiny, like a toy car you'd see in a store, but way bigger. The windows were dark, so you couldn't see inside right away. Then the door opened, and out stepped Richard Grayson. He was a billionaire, a guy with so much money he could buy 1,000,000 ice cream cones and still have cash left over. He wore a suit that looked expensive, and his shoes clicked on the ground like he was important. Richard was a businessman. That means he made big deals and talked on the phone a lot. He didn't have time for silly stuff, like waiting too long for his food or chatting about the weather. He was always in a hurry, always busy. Next to him was his son, Tommy. Tommy was a little boy with a big smile, but he couldn't walk. He sat in a wheelchair, strapped in tight so he wouldn't fall. His hands didn't work the way most kids' hands do. He couldn't hold a spoon or a cup by himself. He needed help to eat, and that's where things got tricky. Richard, his dad, wasn't the helping type. He wasn't patient. If Tommy took too long or made a mess, Richard would frown and look away. He acted like he had better things to do. Most days, he'd just sit there, tapping his foot or staring at his fancy phone. Inside the diner, Sarah was wiping down a table when she saw them come in. She didn't know who they were yet, but she noticed Tommy right away. His wheelchair rolled through the door, and his eyes were big and curious, looking around at everything. Sarah liked kids. She liked how they laughed at silly jokes and got excited about little things, like a free cookie. Tommy looked like he could use a friend, and Sarah was good at being a friend. Richard picked a table by the window and sat down. He didn't say much, just pointed at the menu and said, "Coffee. Black." His voice was gruff, like he was mad at the world. Tommy sat next to him, wiggling a little in his chair. Sarah walked over with her notepad, ready to take their order. "Hi there," she said, her voice bright like sunshine. "What can I get you today?" Richard barely looked up. "Just the coffee," he muttered. Then he added, "and something quick for the kid." He didn't even say Tommy's name. Sarah tilted her head and smiled at Tommy. "What do you like, buddy?" she asked. Tommy giggled and pointed at the picture of pancakes on the menu. "Pancakes it is," Sarah said, writing it down. She didn't know it yet, but this moment, this little talk with Tommy was about to change everything. Most people in the diner didn't pay much attention to Sarah. They saw her apron, her messy ponytail, and her sneakers with a hole in the toe. They thought, "Oh, she's just the waitress." They figured she was a girl who didn't have much, just someone who poured coffee and cleaned up spills. Even Richard thought that. He looked at her like she was small, like she didn't matter. He had no idea who she really was. And that's what made the story so fun. Sarah wasn't just a waitress. She was something way bigger, way cooler. But nobody could see it yet, not the other workers, not the customers, and definitely not Richard. Outside, the black car sat there, shiny and quiet. It looked out of place next to the rusty bikes and old trucks parked nearby. The diner wasn't fancy. It had wobbly tables, squeaky chairs, and a jukebox that played the same 5 songs over and over. But it was warm and cozy, like a hug from your grandma. Sarah fit right in, or so everyone thought. She laughed with the cooks, waved at the regulars, and hummed along to the music. She seemed so normal. But deep down, she was hiding something amazing. Something that would make jaws drop and eyes go wide. "Hey, viewers, where are you watching from today?" I ask you with a big grin. Are you at home, munching on snacks? Or maybe at school, sneaking a peek during lunch? Drop it in the comments below. And here's a fun question: Do you think a simple act of kindness can change everything? Like, really change it? Tell me what you think. Back to the story. Sarah didn't act like she was hiding anything. She didn't puff out her chest or brag. She just kept being herself, kind, busy, and always smiling. When Tommy's pancakes came out, she carried the plate over with extra syrup, just how kids like it. Richard was on his phone again, talking loud about some big meeting. He didn't even notice Tommy trying to grab the fork, his little hands shaking. Sarah did, though. She saw everything. And that's when she decided to do something small but something that would start a chain of surprises nobody saw coming. The diner kept buzzing. People ate their burgers and sipped their drinks. The clock ticked on the wall, and the day rolled on like any other. But it wasn't any other day. It was the day Sarah's secret would start to peek out, little by little. Richard thought he was the big shot, the guy in charge. He had no clue that Sarah's sweet, quiet Sarah was about to turn his world upside down. And Tommy? Little Tommy with the big smile. He was the key to it all. So there they were, Sarah, the waitress with a secret, Richard, the rich guy with no patience, and Tommy, the boy who just wanted pancakes. 3 people in a tiny diner, about to start a story so wild, you'd never believe it. What was Sarah hiding? Why did she care so much about Tommy? And what was going to happen when Richard found out the truth? Stick around, because this is just the beginning, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's next. Sarah was busy at the diner, wiping tables and pouring coffee, when she saw something that made her stop. Little Tommy, the boy in the wheelchair, was trying so hard to eat. His spoon wiggled in his hand, but it kept slipping. Pancake bits fell onto his plate, and his face scrunched up like he was about to cry. His dad, Richard, didn't even look at him. He was too busy yelling into his fancy phone. "No, I said tomorrow," he barked, his voice loud and grumpy. He acted like Tommy wasn't even there, like his son was invisible. Sarah didn't like that. Not one bit. She put down her rag, walked over to their table, and knelt beside Tommy. "Hey, buddy," she said softly, her voice warm like a cozy blanket. She picked up the spoon, scooped up some pancake, and held it to his mouth. "There you go," she whispered with a big smile. Tommy's eyes got bright, and he giggled a happy little sound that made Sarah's heart feel full. He opened his mouth, and she fed him, one bite at a time. His cheeks puffed out like a chipmunk, and he clapped his hands. Richard didn't notice at first. He was still talking on his phone, waving his hand like he was mad at the whole world. But then he looked up. His eyes narrowed, and his face turned sour, like he'd just bitten a lemon. "What do you think you're doing?" he snapped at Sarah. His voice was sharp and mean, cutting through the air like a knife. "He's fine. Stop that." He acted like Sarah was doing something wrong, like she was bothering him instead of helping. Sarah didn't argue. She just nodded, keeping her face calm and polite. "Okay," she said quietly, but she didn't stop feeding Tommy. She kept going, slow and steady, making sure he got every bite. Tommy smiled bigger, and that made her happy. But inside? Oh, inside, Sarah was mad. Really mad. Her tummy felt hot, like a fire was burning. She didn't show it, though. She was good at hiding how she felt. See, Sarah didn't like people like Richard. He was rich, super rich, with his shiny car and fancy suit. He walked around like he owned everything, even the diner. He talked to people like they were small, like they didn't matter. To him, Sarah was just a waitress, just a girl who brought food and cleaned up messes. He didn't think she was important. He didn't think she could be anything more. And that made Sarah's blood boil. People like him always acted so big, so full of themselves. They never stopped to see the truth. And the truth? Sarah wasn't just some nobody. She was way more than he could ever guess. Tommy finished his bite and giggled again. Sarah wiped his chin with a napkin, gentle as can be. Richard put his phone down and stared at her. His eyes were cold, like ice cubes. "I said he's fine," he grumbled again. "You don't need to do that." He sounded annoyed, like Sarah was a fly buzzing around his head. She looked at him, still smiling, and said, "I don't mind. He's a good kid." Her voice was nice, but inside, she wanted to yell. She wanted to tell him to stop being so mean, to pay attention to his own son. But she didn't. Not yet. Richard huffed and leaned back in his chair. Whatever, he muttered, picking up his coffee. He took a sip and went back to his phone, tapping away like nothing happened. He didn't thank Sarah. He didn't even look at Tommy, who was clapping his hands and making happy noises. To Richard, it was just another day. To him, Sarah was just a waitress, someone to boss around. But she wasn't. She was hiding something big, something amazing. And every time Richard acted rude, it made her secret feel even stronger. The diner was noisy around them. People laughed and ate their food. Forks clinked on plates, and the jukebox played a bouncy song. But at that table, things felt tight like a rubber band stretched too far. Sarah kept feeding Tommy, and he kept smiling. She told him little jokes, like, "Why did the pancake sit alone?" "Because it didn't want to get eaten." Tommy laughed, and his giggles were like music. Richard didn't care. He just kept ignoring them, acting like he was the king of the world. Sarah's hands moved slow and careful, but her mind was racing. She didn't like how Richard talked to her like she was nothing. She didn't like how he treated Tommy like he was a problem instead of a kid. Every time he snapped at her, it made her madder. But it also made her stronger. She had a secret, and it was bubbling up inside her, ready to come out. She wasn't going to let Richard push her around forever. Oh no. She was waiting for the right moment, the perfect time to show him who she really was. The other workers in the diner didn't see it either. They liked Sarah, sure. She was always nice to them, always helping out. But they thought she was just like them, a girl with a regular job, nothing special. They didn't know the fire in her heart or the big surprise she was hiding. And Richard? He was the worst. He looked at her like she was dirt on his shiny shoes. Every mean word he said, every time he rolled his eyes, it added up. Sarah kept it all in her head, like a list. She wasn't going to forget. Tommy finished his pancakes, and Sarah set the spoon down. "All done," she said, giving him a high five. His little hand slapped hers, and he beamed. Richard glanced over, annoyed again. "Took long enough," he said under his breath. Sarah heard him, but she didn't say anything. She just smiled at Tommy and stood up. Inside, though, she was ready to burst. She wasn't going to let Richard win. Not today, not ever. The air felt heavy, like a storm was coming. Sarah walked back to the counter, her sneakers squeaking on the floor. She looked normal on the outside, apron tied, hair messy, tray in her hand. But inside, she was buzzing. Richard had no idea what was coming. He thought he was better than her, smarter than her. He thought she was just a waitress with nothing to her name. Oh, how wrong he was. The tension was building, like a balloon getting too full of air. Soon, it would pop. And when it did, everyone would see the real Sarah. So there they sat, Tommy, happy and full, Richard, rude and clueless, and Sarah, quiet but ready. The diner kept going like nothing was wrong, but something big was brewing. Richard's mean words and cold looks were digging him a hole. And Sarah? She was about to climb out of hers and show the world what she could do. Stick around, because this is where it gets good. Days went by, and the little diner on Main Street stayed busy. The sun came up, the sun went down, and Richard kept coming back. Every time, he rolled up in his shiny black car with Tommy by his side. Tommy's wheelchair squeaked a little as they came through the door, and his big eyes looked around, excited to be there. Sarah was always ready. She'd see them, grab a plate of pancakes, and head right over. She didn't wait for Richard to say anything. She just knelt down next to Tommy and started feeding him, like it was the most normal thing in the world. "Here's a big bite, buddy," she'd say, and Tommy would giggle, his mouth full of syrup. Richard didn't yell at her anymore. Not like before. But he watched her now, watched her real close. His eyes weren't warm or friendly. They were cold, like the ice in his fancy coffee. He'd sit there, arms crossed, staring at Sarah while she helped Tommy. One day, he leaned forward and said, "You're too nice." His voice was low, like he didn't mean it as a good thing. He said it like being nice was silly or weak. Sarah didn't get mad, though. She just shrugged her shoulders and said, "I like helping." Then she went back to Tommy, wiping his chin with a napkin. But inside, she was smiling. Not a big smile, you could see just a little one in her head. Richard didn't know it, but she was starting to play a game. See, Sarah wasn't just feeding Tommy because she was nice. She was watching, too. She noticed things about Richard, little things he didn't want anyone to see. Like how his hands shook sometimes when he held his phone. It wasn't a big shake, just a tiny wiggle, but Sarah saw it. He'd hide it fast, stuffing his hands in his pockets or gripping his cup tighter. She also noticed he never said thank you. Not once. She'd bring him coffee, feed his son, clean up the mess, and nothing. He'd just grunt or nod, like she was supposed to do it. That made her tummy twist, but it also made her curious. Why was he like that? What was he hiding? Sarah decided to have some fun. She started dropping little hints, tiny clues about who she really was. One day, Richard asked her, "So, what do you do besides this?" He waved his hand around the diner, like it was a boring place. Sarah smiled, but not her usual smile. This one was sneaky, like a fox. "Oh, I know people," she said. "People in high places." She didn't explain. She just walked away to get more coffee, leaving Richard with a funny look on his face. "Another time," he said, "you don't talk much about yourself." Sarah grinned and said, "Maybe I've got big secrets." Then she winked at Tommy, who laughed like it was a joke. Richard didn't laugh. He squinted at her, like he was trying to figure out a puzzle. But he didn't ask more. Not yet. Every day was like this now. Richard and Tommy would come in, and Sarah would be there feeding Tommy, chatting with him, making him happy. She'd tell him silly stories, like, once there was a pancake that ran away because it didn't want syrup. Tommy would clap and bounce in his chair, loving every word. Richard watched, and his cold eyes got narrower. He didn't like how happy Tommy was with Sarah. Or maybe he didn't like that she wasn't scared of him. Most people in the diner acted nervous around Richard. He was rich and loud, after all. But Sarah? She didn't care. She just kept being herself, dropping her little hints and waiting. The other workers started to notice, too. One of the cooks, a guy named Mike, said, "Sarah, you're good with that kid." She nodded and said, "He's easy to like." Mike laughed and went back to flipping burgers. The other waitress, Jenny, whispered once, "That guy Richard, he's kinda mean, huh?" Sarah just smiled and said, "He's not so tough." Jenny didn't get it, but Sarah did. She was building something big. Every hint, every smile, every time she helped Tommy, it was like stacking blocks. Soon, the tower would be tall enough for everyone to see. Richard wasn't catching on, not really. He'd mutter stuff like, "You're weird," or "Why do you care so much?" Sarah would shrug again and say, "Just do." But she saw how he looked at her now. He wasn't sure what to think. One minute, he'd act like she was nothing, just a waitress with a tray. The next, he'd stare like she was a mystery he couldn't solve. His hands kept shaking, though. And he still didn't say thank you. That told Sarah all she needed to know. He thought he was the boss, the big guy. But he wasn't. Not to her. The diner stayed the same, loud and busy. Plates clinked, people talked, and the jukebox sang its songs. But something was changing. It was slow, like a turtle walking, but it was there. Sarah was getting ready. Each day, she added a little more to her plan. She'd say things like, "I've seen fancy places, you know," or "I've got friends who'd surprise you." Richard would frown, but he didn't ask what she meant. Maybe he didn't want to know. Maybe he thought she was joking. Oh, he was so wrong. Tommy loved it all. He'd light up when Sarah came over, reaching out with his wobbly hands. She'd high-five him and say, "You're my favorite customer." He'd laugh so hard he'd almost tip his chair. Richard didn't laugh. He'd sip his coffee and watch, his face hard like a rock. But Sarah didn't mind. She was patient. She knew her moment was coming, a big, exciting moment that would flip everything upside down. The tension was growing, like a balloon filling with air. Richard didn't see it, but Sarah did. She felt it every time he grumbled at her, every time he ignored Tommy. She was collecting all those moments, saving them up. Soon, she'd use them. Soon, he'd find out she wasn't just a waitress. She was something way bigger, something he'd never expect. And Tommy? Sweet little Tommy was the key. He didn't know it, but he was helping Sarah build her surprise. So the days kept passing, and the diner kept buzzing. Sarah kept feeding Tommy, dropping her hints, and watching Richard. He kept being rude, thinking he was better than everyone. But Sarah wasn't worried. She was ready. Each little clue she left was like a breadcrumb, leading to the big finish. Richard's world was about to turn upside down, and he had no idea. Stick around, this is getting good. It was a rainy afternoon, and the sky was all gray and grumpy. Raindrops tapped on the diner's windows, making everything feel wet and wild. Inside, the door slammed open, and Richard stormed in like a big, angry bear. His fancy suit was soaked, sticking to him like wet paper. His hair dripped, and his face was red, super red, like he'd just run a race and lost. "Where's Sarah?" he shouted, his voice loud and mean. The other waitresses froze, their eyes big. They didn't say a word, just pointed to the back of the diner, where the kitchen was. Richard didn't wait. He marched right through, his wet shoes squeaking on the floor. He was ready to yell, ready to tell Sarah off for some tiny thing she did wrong. Oh, but he had no idea what was coming. Back there, behind the swinging kitchen door, Sarah was waiting. Richard pushed the door open and stopped like he'd hit a wall. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Sarah wasn't how he expected her to be. She wasn't wearing her apron with the ketchup stains. She wasn't holding a tray or a rag. Nope. She stood tall in a sleek, shiny suit, black and smooth, like something a movie star would wear. Her hair wasn't messy anymore, it was neat and pretty. And behind her, two men stood there, looking serious. They wore fancy coats and held briefcases, those big bags grown UPS carry important stuff in. Richard blinked, like he couldn't believe his eyes. Sarah looked at him, calm as can be. "Mr. Grayson," she said, her voice steady and strong, "I think it's time you met the real me." She didn't yell or cry. She just stepped forward and handed him a little card. It was white and crisp, with fancy writing on it. Richard took it with shaky hands and read it out loud, slow and confused. Sarah Miller, CEO of Miller Care Foundation. His jaw dropped all the way to the floor. His eyes got huge, and his face went from red to white, like he'd seen a ghost. Here's the big surprise, Sarah wasn't just a waitress. Nope. She was a millionaire, a super rich lady who had tons of money. But she didn't waste it on fancy cars or big houses. She built a company called the Miller Care Foundation. That company helped kids like Tommy, who couldn't walk or feed themselves. She made places where they could play, learn, and feel happy. And get this, she'd been working at the diner undercover. That means she pretended to be a regular waitress, hiding who she really was. Why? Because she wanted to see how people acted when they thought she was nobody. She wanted to know who was nice and who was mean without all the money stuff getting in the way. Richard stared at the card, then at Sarah, then back at the card. His mouth moved, but only sputters came out. You tricked me," he finally yelled, his voice all wobbly. He pointed at her like she'd played a big prank on him. Sarah didn't flinch. She just smiled a small, quiet smile and said, "No. I didn't trick you. I just let you show me who you are." Her words hit him like a splash of cold water. He stepped back, blinking fast, like he didn't know what to say. The kitchen was quiet now. The cook stopped flipping burgers. The waitresses peeked through the door, holding their breath. Everyone wanted to see what would happen. Richard's face turned red again, but not from the rain. He was mad and embarrassed. He'd been rude to Sarah every day. He'd snapped at her, ignored her, acted like she was nothing. And now he knew she was a big deal, bigger than him, even. She had money, sure, but she also had power. Real power. The kind that comes from helping people, not yelling at them. Sarah stood there, cool as a cucumber. The two men behind her didn't say anything, they just watched, like guards protecting a queen. Richard crumpled the card in his hand, his fingers shaking worse than ever. This can't be real," he mumbled. But it was. Oh, it was so real. Sarah had been there all along, feeding Tommy, smiling at him, making him laugh. She wasn't doing it because she had to. She did it because she cared, because that's who she was. And Richard? He'd missed it. He'd been too busy being grumpy and rude to see the truth. The rain kept tapping outside, but inside, everything felt different. Sarah's suit sparkled under the kitchen lights, and her eyes were bright, not mad, just sure. She'd planned this moment. All those days of dropping hints, all those times she said weird stuff like "I know people in high places," it was leading up to this. She wanted Richard to see her for real. Not the waitress with the apron, but the lady who could change lives. And Tommy? Sweet little Tommy was why she did it. She saw him struggling, saw how his dad didn't help, and decided to step in. Now Richard knew, she wasn't small. She was huge. Richard's big voice was gone. He didn't yell anymore. He just stood there, wet and quiet, looking at Sarah like she was a stranger. And in a way, she was. He thought he knew her, thought she was just a girl who poured coffee. But he was wrong. So wrong. The air felt thick, like before a big storm. The other workers whispered to each other, their eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" one said. "She's a millionaire," another gasped. They couldn't believe it either. Sarah, their Sarah, was a secret superhero. She didn't laugh at Richard or make fun of him. She didn't need to. The truth was enough. He'd been mean to her, ignored Tommy, acted like he was better than everyone. And now the tables had turned big time. Sarah's card said it all: she wasn't just rich, she was important. She helped kids. She made the world better. Richard couldn't say that. All he had was his money and his shiny car. And right then, he looked small, like a kid caught stealing cookies. The big reveal was here, and it was wild. Sarah wasn't hiding anymore. She stood tall, her suit shining, her voice clear. Richard couldn't argue. He couldn't snap or grumble. He just stared, his mouth still open, the crumpled card in his hand. The diner wasn't just a diner anymore, it was the place where everything changed. And Sarah? She was the star. The quiet girl who flipped Richard's world upside down. What would he do now? What would happen next? Oh, you've got to keep reading, this is the best part yet. The truth smashed into Richard like a big, loud truck. He couldn't hide from it. Sarah wasn't joking around or playing silly games. She was serious, super serious. She'd already given millions of dollars, tons of money, to build a special place for kids like Tommy. A place where kids who couldn't walk or eat by themselves could have fun, feel safe, and be happy. She looked right at Richard, her eyes strong and clear, and said, "You've got all that money, but you don't even see your own son. Maybe it's time to change that." Her words were simple, but they hit hard. Richard blinked, like he'd been slapped by the truth. The diner got noisy fast. Everyone started whispering, their voices buzzing like bees. "Did you hear that?" one waitress said. "She's a hero," a cook added. Richard didn't say a word. His face was still red, but now it was because he was embarrassed, really embarrassed. He turned around, his wet coat flapping, and stormed out the door. The rain splashed on him as he left, and the diner went quiet for a second. Everyone watched him go, wondering what he'd do next. But here's the cool part, he came back. The very next day, Richard walked into the diner again. This time, he wasn't loud or mad. He was quiet, super quiet. His fancy suit was dry now, and his hands didn't shake as much. He walked up to Sarah, who was wiping a table, and held out a piece of paper. It was a check, a big one with lots of zeros on it. "For Tommy," he mumbled, his voice so low you could barely hear it. He didn't look at her eyes. He just handed it over and stood there, waiting. Sarah didn't cheer or jump up and down. She didn't brag or say, "I told you so." She just took the check, looked at it, and nodded. "Thanks," she said simply, like it was no big deal. Then she went right back to work, carrying plates and pouring coffee. But inside, she knew she'd won. Not a mean kind of winning, she didn't want to hurt Richard. She just wanted him to see what really mattered. And now, he was starting to. That check was for her foundation, to help Tommy and other kids. Richard was finally doing something good. The other workers couldn't believe it. They used to ignore Sarah, thinking she was just a regular girl with an apron. Now, they stared at her like she was a superstar. "Wow, Sarah," one said, "you're amazing." Another clapped her on the back and grinned. They saw her differently now. She wasn't just the waitress who cleaned up spills. She was strong, smart, and kinda real hero. She'd earned their respect, and it felt good. Richard didn't stay long. He sat with Tommy for a bit, quieter than usual, then left. But something had changed. Sarah had shown him the truth, and he couldn't unsee it. Justice was served not with yelling or fighting, but with kindness and facts. Sarah kept working, smiling like always, knowing she'd made a difference. The diner buzzed again, but this time, it was full of awe and happiness. Sarah had won and so had Tommy. And just like that, bam, one tiny act of kindness grew into something giant. Sarah didn't need a shiny car or a big, loud title to show she was special. She didn't need piles of money or fancy clothes to prove she was worth something. Nope. She showed it every single day, in the simplest way, with a smile. Every time she helped Tommy, every time she fed him pancakes or made him laugh, she was shining. That's what made her big, not the stuff she owned, but the love she gave. One little moment helping a kid with a spoon turned into a huge story that changed everything. Crazy, right? So here's something to think about, friends: the quiet ones, the people nobody notices, they might be the real heroes. You know, those kids at school who don't talk a lot? Or the grown UPS who just do their jobs without making a fuss? They could be the ones who turn the world upside down in a good way. Sarah was like that. Everyone thought she was just a waitress, nothing special. But she was a secret superstar, hiding right in front of them. And when she showed who she really was, wow, it was like magic. That's the cool thing about kindness. It doesn't need to be loud or flashy. It can be small, like sharing your snack with a friend or helping someone pick up their books when they drop them. But those little things, they add up. They grow. They can make someone's day better, and maybe even change their whole life. Sarah didn't shout about how great she was. She just kept being nice, kept caring about Tommy, and that's what made her powerful. Not her money, not her company, her heart. So what about you? You don't have to be a millionaire or a boss to make a difference. You can be you, just you, and still do something awesome. Maybe you held the door for someone with heavy bags. Maybe you smiled at a kid who looked sad. Those tiny acts? They're like seeds. Plant them, and they grow into something big and beautiful. Sarah's story shows us that. She started with a spoon and a pancake, and ended up teaching a grumpy guy like Richard to care. If she can do that, imagine what you can do. Hey, friends, let's talk. Tell me in the comments, what's one kind thing you've done that made a difference? Did you help a friend? Share something cool? Say something nice? I want to hear all about it. Let's keep this happy vibe going, okay? Drop your stories below, I can't wait to read them. The world's full of quiet heroes like Sarah. They don't need capes or loud cheers. They just need a chance to shine. So next time you see someone being kind, even in a small way, give them a smile. They might be changing the world, one little step at a time. And you? You can do it too. Be kind, be brave, and watch what happens. It's pretty amazing.